Welcome everyone to session 11 of the story as we continue to make our way through the first book of the Bible, Genesis. Today we start a new section of the book of Genesis, the final section, as we enter into the story of Joseph. This is not the story of Joseph, Jesus' father, an entirely different character who comes much later in the biblical story. But this is the story of Joseph, the son of Jacob, best known for his coat of many colors. Before we dive into today's study, I invite you to take a moment and read Genesis chapter 37. Go ahead and press pause on this video, read through Genesis chapter 37, and then press play for our discussion today. Well, as you can see, the drama of Genesis continues in full force as we begin the Joseph story. Jacob, Joseph's father, having returned from the land of Haran, where he had worked a deal with Laban for a wife, Rachel, out of which he ends up with two wives, Leah and Rachel, and their maid servants, Bilhah and Zilpah. Jacob, having returned from his escapades in the land of Haran, ends up settling back in the land of Canaan, which was the land of Jacob's father Isaac, the land that had been promised to Isaac's father Abraham. Joseph, who is one of Jacob's sons, one of the youngest of his sons, being just 17 years old, is found helping his older brothers shepherd one of his father's flocks. At the end of the day, Joseph, however, brings a bad report to his dad about his older brothers. We learn in this story that Jacob, who is also referred to as Israel, loves Joseph more than all of his other sons. And to show his love, Jacob makes for Joseph a long robe, one that had sleeves. As a result, Joseph's brothers grow jealous of him, jealous that his father Jacob loved him more than Jacob loved the rest of them. And therefore, Joseph's brothers develop a hatred inside of them toward their brother. Joseph then has a dream. He makes the mistake of telling his dream to his brothers, which make his brothers hate him even more. In the first dream that Jacob has here in Genesis chapter 37, Joseph sees a sheaf rising and standing upright. The other sheaves, presumably representing his brothers, gather around Joseph's sheaf and end up bowing down to it. As a result, his brothers hate him even more. Joseph then has a second dream. It is a dream in which he sees the sun and the moon and 11 stars, representing his 11 brothers, all bowing down to him, just like their sheaves did to Joseph's sheaf. This time he tells his dream both to his father and to his brothers. At first, Joseph's father Jacob rebukes Joseph and questions the validity of his dream. The brothers continue to increase in their jealousy of their younger brother Joseph. But at the end of this section, we read that Joseph's father Jacob kept the matter in mind. Although Joseph's father Jacob may have questioned Joseph's dream, he also had doubt in his heart. He had some question in his heart as to whether there might actually be something to what Joseph was sharing with them. Joseph's brothers then go out to pasture one of the many flocks that they were in charge of, and Israel, also Jacob, sends Joseph to check on his older brothers. Joseph goes out searching for them and eventually finds his brothers at Dothan. Seeing their brother Joseph from a distance, his older brothers conspire to kill him, deciding to throw Joseph into a pit and then reporting that a wild animal had eaten him. One of Joseph's brothers, however, his brother who was known as Reuben, wants nothing of this evil scheme. He pleads with his brothers to not harm Joseph and to simply throw him into the pit unscathed so that Reuben could return to the pit later and rescue his younger brother. His brothers end up throwing him into the pit. They strip him of his clothes and throw him into the pit, in which it is noted that there was no water. Joseph's brothers then sit down to eat. They have a picnic while their brother Joseph is down in the bottom of the pit. And while they are eating their fried chicken, they see a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, traveling on their way from Gilead down to Egypt. Joseph's brother Judah suggests selling Joseph to these Ishmaelites. The other brothers agree, and they end up selling their younger brother Joseph for 20 pieces of silver. The Ishmaelites then take Joseph to Egypt. Reuben, however, the brother who wanted to make sure that Joseph wasn't killed, had apparently not stayed for the picnic with his other brothers, because when Reuben comes back later to rescue Joseph, he is beside himself when he sees that the pit is empty, and he tears his clothes. Reporting the news to his brothers, the brothers take Joseph's robe, slaughter a goat, dip the robe in the goat's blood. Then they go and present the robe to their father, tricking their father into believing that his beloved son Joseph had been killed. Joseph's father Jacob is overwhelmed with grief, grieving for many days. While Jacob is grieving in Canaan, the Midianites sell Joseph in Egypt to one of the guards of the Pharaoh's kingdom, a guard whose name is Potiphar. Genesis chapter 37 ends then with Jacob, Joseph's dad, filled with grief, and Joseph now in the custody of Pharaoh's court in the land of Egypt. Next week, we will find out how the story of Joseph continues. But let me share a few theological points with you from the beginning of Joseph's story here in chapter 37. Remember, God, way back in the beginning of Genesis, had chosen Abraham and Sarai. God had made to them a promise, a covenant, saying that God would remain their God forever. God would be in relationship with them, and that they would be the ancestors of many nations. At this point in the story, this promise that God made to Abraham and Sarai now rests on Joseph. The continuation of God's promise depends on him. In the words of Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann, without Joseph, there is no future. As we see God doing throughout all of Scripture, God here uses the least and the lowly. Remember, Joseph is one of the youngest of Jacob's sons. Thereby we see God, through Jacob, choosing the last to be first. We may be reminded of how the angel Gabriel comes to Mary much later in the New Testament and chooses Mary, one of the lowly ones, to be the one to bear Jesus into the world. When God chooses the last and makes the last first, this almost always creates tension and conflict, as it does here in Genesis chapter 27. The conflict arises from the power of Joseph's two dreams, dreams that were supposedly given to him by God. Joseph's dreams for Joseph are dreams of hope for a plentiful and abundant future. But they are also dreams that threaten the status quo for his older brothers. How often dreams from God do that very thing? They threaten the status quo. They make the powerful and the strong nervous. They lift up the lowly, but they bring down the mighty. Joseph, one of the youngest of Jacob's sons, embraces the promise contained in these dreams, but his older brothers seek to kill it. Still, at the end of chapter 37, we see that God's promises to Abraham cannot be killed. Joseph indeed makes his way to Egypt. Still, there is hope. The story of God's promise to Abraham and the story of God's promise to each of us continues. Through Joseph, an unexpected son, now living in an unexpected and foreign land, the dream of God, the promise of God continues.